The Israel Lobby redefines anti-Semitism as criticism of Israel and anti-Zionism, and we need to be able to challenge that. We need to be able to understand what anti-Semitism really is in order to rebut the false allegations. Keep going. To understand and clean up real anti-Semitic attitudes which we might carry innocently, nobody is to blame for that, which undermine our credibility when we say things that offend other people. And we need to counter the serious threats to criminalize our work as anti-Semitic. We are all good. Standing in support of Palestinian rights is courageous and ethical. No one deserves blame for carrying anti-Semitic or any other prejudices that we take on from living in a society full of oppressions. And facing these prejudices is both possible and desirable. No one here is an anti-Semite, although all of us here probably carry some misinformation or attitudes that we innocently grew up with. Peter was telling me a few months ago that he grew up thinking that the word Jew was a bad thing to say to somebody, you know. It's just innocent. So no matter what, we are all good. You are good. And you don't deserve any blame. So let's just talk about the changing nature of the definitions of anti-Semitism. Like racism, sexism, and homophobia, the term anti-Semitism didn't even exist until relatively recently. It was just taken for granted that it was normal to hate Jews. In 1879, the German journalist William Marz coined the pseudo-scientific term anti-Semitismus to oppose Jews who he saw as infiltrating German culture. And the reason he said anti-Semitism, he'd actually never met anyone who was Palestinian or Middle Eastern. It was all about the pseudo-notion that Semitic people, that is Jews, people with big noses, were bad and inferior and dangerous. So at that point, there was no concept of anti-Semitism as something that we shouldn't do. Believing that Jews are a separate people who need their own country was originally considered anti-Semitic, and people would get accused of having dual loyalties if they were wanted to go to Jerusalem and also wanted to be citizens of their own country. But now, believing that Jews are not a separate people who need their own country is considered anti-Semitic by many. So I just want to hold out for you that this is very relative, it's fluid, and we are part of changing and clarifying what the definition actually is. And it's your right, our obligation, to all stand in solidarity with Palestinian people and to affirm that supporting justice for Palestinians is just, and it's not anti-Semitic. So what is real anti-Semitism? Hostility, prejudice, or discrimination against Jews and Judaism. And I want to emphasize that it's systemic and institutionalized mistreatment of Jews, oppression, so that for many centuries, as you all know, there were laws against Jews doing a bunch of things. And there was official sanction to go out and kill Jews and expel them and torture them and do the kinds of things that you don't want to do to a people. So similarly, we have that kind of oppressive stuff happening like right now in Quebec with the anti-hijab law. So that's an example of oppression. In Canada, by and large, that doesn't exist anymore. It's in fact illegal and gets punished. So personal prejudice is different from structural oppression. Is that clear? Okay. This is a definition by Brian Klug, he was the founder of Independent Jewish Voices Britain, that we based IJB on, that it's a good summary of what classical anti-Semitism is composed of, the attitudes. It's a European fantasy about Jews as Jews. They're arrogant, secretive, cunning, always looking to turn a profit, loyal only to their own. Wherever they go, they form a state within a state, They prey upon the societies in whose midst they dwell. Mysteriously powerful, the hidden hand of Jews controls the banks and the media. They will even drag governments into war if this suits their purposes. So that's classical anti-Semitism. Here's some quick examples. This is the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, which was used by Hitler and others around the world. It continues to circulate. It's a fraud that was never developed by Jews. It was originally a satire, and has been used to claim that Jews are evil forces trying to control the world. This is a German code postcard that helped to fuel Nazism, where there's an Aryan guy in the middle and some nasty-looking Jews on the right, and a really stupid caricature of a black person on the left. This is the Nazi image of the Jew is shown as secretly controlling Britain, the US, and Russia. This is a US anti-Semitic cartoon saying that Jews are secretly in control of all these things. And it's still present. This is a 2019 Edmonton Journal political cartoon that actually got apologized for, and the cartoonist took it out, and he said, "I didn't know he was looked Jewish." You know,
We're not
Really?
What, we're not.
kind of dynamic. It's cyclical, so that for long periods,
Next one.
great, and great. For long periods, Jews would be tolerated and welcomed for their expertise and as Middle Agents. And so during those periods, it wouldn't appear that Jews were particularly being oppressed. But Sherry Brown talks about it as Jews basically walk around with a loose noose around their neck. And at any point, you can pull it. So that when people rebel, the rulers blame the Jews, and Jews get violently attacked and expelled and forced to convert or to get killed. And then they'd be welcomed by rulers elsewhere or be apologized to wherever they were, but then the next time situations were ripe, they'd get attacked. The point that I want to emphasize here is that this really is not the experience of Mizrahi, Middle Eastern Jews and Sephardic Jews, because in Muslim countries, Jews were welcomed and treated almost as equals and not persecuted. I would say that currently, next slide, Israel plays a similar role in the capitalist system, where it's the hated visible agent of oppression for world imperial and capitalist powers. Jeff Halper talks about how Jews have, or how Israel has a particular niche of marketing and testing awful weapons like the ones that we were talking about before on Palestinians to be used against civil liberties and human rights activists around the world. What Halper says is that whereas people like Harper say we are all Jews, he says we are all becoming Palestinians because Israel is playing that role. And of course, Israel gets enormous financial and political and military support for doing that. So it's anti-Semitic to blame the Jews or even Israel for what is actually a global capitalist web of oppression. But on the other hand, keep going, it's not anti-Semitic to hold Israel to account, like any other country, for its oppressive behavior and policies. And in fact, it's good for all the world, as Ahmed was saying, for all of us to have, it's actually better for the Jews to have a country associated with Jews to be acting humanely and generously in the world. Actually, having Israel play this awful role sets us up for anti-Semitism. But the Israel lobby, next slide, exploits our fear and guilt over anti-Semitism. So anti-Semitic prejudice feels terrifying to many Jews. I was at a Hallmark store the other day, And preparing for this workshop, I had a little booklet that said, "What is anti-Semitism?" And this Jewish woman came up to me and said, "Why are you reading that?" And I said, "I'm giving this workshop on Saturday." And she said, "On Shabbat?"
Doing God's word.
So anyway, the fear of Jews helps to bolster their loyalty to Israel as our only safe haven. And I've actually talked to many Jews who believe that if there's a new Holocaust, we can all go to Israel, like where they can put us. But anyway, and many Christians also support Israel because of feeling guilty about Christian complicity in anti-Semitism leading to the Holocaust. And also, we carry around these notions in our head. And of course, Israel and the lobby exploit those fears and that guilt and that's basically what we're going to be talking about today. Christian Zionism, next slide, is the belief my point here is that Christian Zionism vastly predated Jewish Zionism. Started in the 1600s. In the early 1800s, it started getting called Christian Zionism, and actually there were political movements by Christians to pressure Jews and bribe Jews to move to Jerusalem to bring about the Second Coming and also to set up some strategic footholds. And as you know, many Western supporters of Israel are Christian Zionists. Jason Kenney, Stephen Harper.
Sweet.
What? Who?
David Sweet.
David Sweet, yeah. And they are way more powerful and numerous than Jewish Zionists. So again, to put this in context, Jewish Zionism was a political movement founded by Theodor Herzl in 1895 to create a Jewish state. Its goals were to transform the transnational Jewish identity centered on the Torah. Basically, our identity was based on following the 613 mitzvot, good deeds, that are listed in the Torah, which relate to generosity and humanity and being humble and they
Not
despise
eating.
what?
And not eating pigs.
And not eating pigs and other things, or shrimp. Anyway, it was to transform that into a national identity and to secure Jewish political and economic control over Palestine. The imperial forces and Christian Zionists backed the Jewish state. We have here the Balfour Declaration from 2017 promising the Jews a national homeland without ever consulting the local folks. And all these governments backed the movement financially and militarily. And they explicitly said, and the Jewish Zionists were actually selling it, Herzl was selling it as saying, "We will get rid of your Jews for you." So there was fundamental, deep anti-Semitism in Zionism. Zionism doesn't equal Judaism. Until the Holocaust, all three branches of Judaism and secular progressive Jews and communist Jews opposed the political Zionism because, for different reasons, it violates core Jewish values. In fact, it was explicitly forbidden to Orthodox Jews and most other Jews to even try to attempt to return to Jerusalem until the Messianic era, until the world had been set right, and it was the obligation of Jews to promote Tikkun Olam, the healing of the world, so that could happen. So when you hear Zionists, political Zionists talking about, well, we've been wanting to go to Jerusalem forever, that's not true. That's not the way it actually was. Progressive Jews, communist Jews were saying it was a way of dividing the class struggle, and that Jews should stay and fight for justice everywhere. Jews, for example, in France, who finally won the right to be citizens, were saying, we're going to be accused of dual loyalty. They oppose Zionism. But many Jews and others now equate Judaism with Zionism, and it's very confusing for all of us. Many other Jews, especially young Jews, now reject Zionism. I want to make the point, we've talked about ending decolonizing. I was really pleased that you guys are talking about that. Basically, Israel is a colonial settler state, and it oppresses Palestinians as colonial settlers, not because of Judaism. This is an image, of course, of Canadian Mounties and the church stealing Aboriginal children.
We're not seeing right.
Oh, sorry. There you go. You see? Great. Israel oppresses its indigenous people like other settler colonial states such as Australia, South Africa, the US, and Canada. In much the same ways, oppressed white European people got imperial support to take over indigenous people's lands and expel, exterminate, and/or exploit them. Settler colonial states all claim God-given legitimacy and narratives of victimhood. This is not unique. And they share similar racist genocidal policies. In fact, many of the Jews who opposed the founding of Israel pointed that out from the beginning. They said, if you try to set up a regular state for Jews, it's an ethnocracy and it's ultimately going to turn into this kind of mess. I can go through the anti-Zionist elements of anti-Semitic elements of Zionism. As I've mentioned, Herzl and the Russian Zionist founders of Israel were secular Jews who despised Judaism and observant Jews. They actually explicitly were promoting an Aryan-style vision of what a Jew should look like, strong and pure and healthy, and unlike what they called the ghetto Jew, whom they despised as hunched over and flat-footed and cowardly. And they also treated Holocaust survivors as well as Arab and North African non-white Jews with a lot of racism. So Zionism has a consistent history of being racist and anti-Semitic. They try to eliminate diaspora Jewish culture and Yiddish. You've heard of the so-called new anti-Semitism, and that's what our government keeps referring to. This is a book by Phyllis Chesler that came out, I think, in 1973 or something like that. After there was a lot of outrage over Israel not returning the occupied territories and the intifadas were growing, basically what the new anti-Semitism does is it conflates opposition to Zionism with anti-Semitism. It claims that the Jewish state, Israel, is the collective Jew.
Israel claims that.
Yeah. Yeah. Natan Sharansky came up with this very popular, catchy phrase, the 3 Ds, which is that anyone who's critical of Israel is demonizing, delegitimizing, and holding Israel to double standards. And actually, if you think about it, it's the hardline Zionists who are doing that to us. And it's neither new nor about anti-Semitism. It's a tactic to attack those who support Palestinian rights. There is no such animal as the new anti-Semitism. Basically, what they're trying to do is change the whole definition of what anti-Semitism is. This is a list that my friend Larry Haven developed of false axioms for the new anti-Semitism. And I don't need to take the time to go all through them, but they're ridiculous notions that basically label virtually everything as anti-Semitic. I remember reading a book once that said Jews can get so hypersensitive about anti-Semitism that if someone says to you, "Did you eat yet?" So what is anti-Semitism? What is anti-Zionism? Is it anti-Semitism? No. Anti-Zionism is our opposition to Zionist plans and policies to displace indigenous Palestinians and take over their land, just as we are anti-racist and in solidarity with Palestinians and South Africans, for example. Most Palestinians and their allies oppose the Zionist project, and many of them are Jews. But and here's where it gets confusing. Some anti-Zionists do demonize Jews, and that's anti-Semitism. So these are two images. In the left-hand image, we see a picture of Netanyahu with the Star of David on his head, eating a Palestinian child at a rally, at a Palestinian South. Oops, sorry. Can you bet? I need to get back my arm. I've lost it. And the right-hand one, it says Jews are terrorists. And this is an innocent, probably Palestinian woman with her children dressed in Palestinian flags. What she means by Jews is probably Israelis, but it gets very confusing when Israel's flag is in the shape of a tallis and a prayer shawl, and Israel itself claims it's the collective Jews. So it's very confusing. So I'm saying that these images are anti-Semitic, and these people are not evil. They're just confused. So weaponized anti-Semitic charges have been used, are specifically designed as a strategy to discredit us and attack us and demonize us, hold us to double standards, and criminalize us. And what that does is it derails the attention from the real issues that we're trying to work on to false charges of anti-Semitism. For example, at the World Socialist Forum in Montreal last year, a couple years ago, there were thousands and thousands of exhibits and presentations. One of them was one of these proposals for a presentation was submitted by a group that included an anti-Semitic cartoon. The organizers caught it and did not include it in the program, but this B'nai B'rith and company characterized the entire World Socialist Forum as anti-Semitic, and they had all kinds of press about that, whereas all of this exciting, amazing stuff that was happening was not getting any attention. It forces us to waste our energy on rebutting false charges of anti-Semitism, and as Libby's going to talk about later, it makes it difficult for MPs and the media and others to even discuss Palestinian rights. I mean, one of the things that Peter was mentioning was about how little media the Great March of Return is getting, but if you think about the huge amount of attention that's going to Hong Kong, where hardly anybody's been killed. I mean,
Nobody's been killed.
there have been a couple people who have been killed. Anyway, but no big deal, you know. I mean, it's a big deal, but what about the Great March of Return? So they portray anti-Zionism as just a mask for anti-Semitism. And here are just some examples of weaponized charges. You guys know personally, the United Church of Canada has been attacked for thinking about it. CUPW, the Green Party, as I mentioned, the World Social Forum. In 2011, the Canadian government adopted the Ottawa Protocol on combating anti-Semitism. And in 2016, the government denounced supporters of BDS as anti-Semitic. And neither of those things had any legislative power. But this year, in June, the Canadian government adopted the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, which does threaten to criminalize us. And I'll talk more about that. It's also used to attack, for example, progressive women leaders. I've included Libby on this list. For supporting Palestinian rights. This is an image of Angela Davis when she was younger. She's being called communist anti-Israel BDS supporter, and then if you see it, it says BDS, the final solution to the Israel problem. So it's basically equating her and our struggle to Nazis, to promoting the final solution. This is another example of claiming that any examples of Palestinian violence, like flying the kites over the walls and shooting ineffectual Hamas rockets, is motivated by anti-Semitism, as opposed to any legitimacy of what's going on for Palestinians. So let me talk a little bit about the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. I've given you all a copy of the definition itself, and if you read it, it looks reasonable at first glance. If you didn't know anything about the movement, who wouldn't be against anti-Semitism? It's the one that has the circle at the top.